professor at the Shenandoah Conservatory, which is part of Shenandoah University here in Winchester, Virginia. And I'm coming to you once again here in my clarinet studio here at the conservatory to give you another class, this time on, I believe it's rotation E, the Etude, the prepared Etude rather, for the All-State audition, which is coming up in about 3 weeks. So yeah, I'm here to give you some what I hope will be helpful hints and helpful suggestions on preparing this piece. And as in the past, I will go ahead and play it for you, and then I will come back and we will talk about it. So let's talk about the piece a bit. This piece for this year is technically, I think, a little bit less challenging than in the past. So hopefully most of you will find that you have a little bit easier time negotiating the technical passages of this piece compared to ones in the past. Also, the tempo of this piece is a bit slower, which is also very nice. So it gives you a chance to play a little bit more expressively and to show off that side of your playing. Rather than a lot of really fast technical challenges. So for most of you, or hopefully for all of you, you will find that this piece is a little bit easier to negotiate than the etudes in the past. So today, I think what I'll do is I'm going to discuss sort of six categories that I suspect you will be adjudicated on when you play this piece. These are not all the categories that you'll be adjudicated on when you play the piece, but I think these six categories that I'm going to introduce now are ones that are pretty applicable to this piece, right? So these categories are your tempo accuracy, right? How well you adhere to the tempo. Your rhythm, right? Making sure that you're playing all the rhythms in the piece accurately. Note accuracy, making sure that you're playing all the pitches correctly. Dynamic contrast, making sure that you're following the dynamics that are written in the score and that you adequately show these dynamic differences when you're playing. And then we have the correct articulations, which is probably another area you'll be adjudicated on because we have a bit of a variety, once again in this etude as we have in the past, we have a variety of articulations that present several challenges in the piece. So that's another area that you're likely to be adjudicated on and that you want to pay attention to as you practice the piece. And then lastly, or maybe not lastly, but perhaps most importantly, we have the phrasing in the piece, how you phrase the music, how you give direction to the music when you're playing, and this sort of thing. So these are the six categories that I'll sort of focus on in this class, and we'll sort of discuss the challenges of each of them as they arise in the piece. So I think I'm going to start by talking about the articulations that we find in this piece, right? As we look at it, we find primarily a lot of notes with dashes on the top of them, right? And this is what we call a tenuto marking. And generally what this means in music is that we play this note a little bit on the longer side, but in terms of articulation-wise, these notes with the tenutos often have a sort of softer attack to them, not such a harsh attack as you would find with an accent or perhaps a staccato, right? So we see a lot of these dashed notes throughout the whole piece. In fact, the whole piece starts with an open G that has a dash over it, right? So we want to think about how we want to approach these notes. And my suggestion is to think of these notes as notes that we lean against when we're playing, right? So they sort of have the sound of the syllable da. So da against them, or ha, maybe even ha. So that they are delicately attacked and have this sort of leaning feeling on them. And that will create a really excellent tenuto throughout the piece. Again, you will find these throughout the whole piece. We begin with one, there's another one, there's ones in the third measure. You often see quarter notes with dashes, you often see eighth notes with dashes, and sometimes dotted eighth notes with dashes in this piece. So I think it's a good idea to think of them all on the slightly long side with this sort of nice attack and sort of this idea of ha or da as you play through them. And that's going to make you play them very, very well. The next articulation we want to talk about in this piece are the accents. There are, I believe, 5 of them in the piece. Most of them occur in places you would expect to find them. For instance, measure 9, we find them on beat 1, we find one on beat 3. Measure 12, we find one on beat 4. Kind of places that work in terms of producing an accent well and having it fall in a place in the beat where it makes sense. One place you should look at is measure 7, however. This is a place where the accent falls on the 2nd 16th of beat 2. This is a little bit of a surprise. I suspect it's probably been put in the music in order to surprise you, to catch you off guard. And so you want to watch out for that one. That one is a little bit tricky to play just because of where it falls in the beat. So be a little bit careful with that one, right? And then of course when we play accents compared to the dash or tenuto notes that we played before, these are notes that get a little bit more energy on the front end of the attack, more of a kind of a da sound like that, and get a little bit more emphasis, right? So you want to find those 5 places in the score, or in the part rather, where you find these accents, and then use a little bit more air when you play them, push the air through, and attack the beginning of the note a little bit stronger. So this would mean with a little bit stronger tongue stroke, so that these notes sort of pop out of the texture, so to speak, much more so than the dashed notes do. Okay? And this is going to provide an excellent contrast when you play the dash notes the way we spoke of previously, and when you play the accented notes the way we're speaking of now. And the adjudicators are going to like that very much. Yeah? Good. So the other thing to pay attention to in this piece in terms of articulations is exactly where you tongue notes and where you don't tongue notes. And what I mean by that is that there are many places in this piece where there are 2 notes groupings that are slurred together, where you begin those groupings with the tongue, right? One of those falls on the last beat of measure 5, another one falls on the 2nd beat of measure 4. These are places where you have dia, so it's ta, 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 ta. In other words, you articulate the beginning of the 2 note slurs. What I have found is that a lot of students will kind of ignore these markings in the music, and so they end up slurring everything. In fact, I might have done a little bit of that actually when I performed the piece. It's possible because there are so many duple slurs in this piece that it's kind of tricky to catch all of them. So do your best to mark in the music where these 2 note dia slurs and attacks occur, and make sure again that you always articulate the beginning of slurred groupings, right? This happens throughout the piece. And again, I have a feeling these groupings are here in order to throw you off and in order to have you sort of fall into the trap of playing these passages all slurred rather than articulated at the beginning of the slurs. So be careful. The piece is riddled with these 2 note groupings, which are tongued at the beginning of each one. So be careful about that, yeah? Good, all right, so now we move on to the dynamics, right? Dynamic contrast being, again, something that you want to show when you perform this piece. And when we look at the dynamics in this piece, unless I'm totally off base here, about 15 out of the 22 measures of this piece are marked with the mezzo forte dynamic, which, if you have watched my videos in the past, you know how I really do not like the dynamic mezzo forte, and how I find it to be kind of a nothing dynamic. So, having a piece with 15 measures of mezzo forte out of 22 measures makes this a little bit tricky. So, what do we do? Or what do we do in general when a piece has the same dynamic marking marked over and over and over? Well, one of the things we can do is to think of these dynamic markings in terms of the character, right? So you can, for instance, at the beginning of the piece, you can cross out the mezzo forte and you can write a word that sort of describes what's going on in the music, right? So if I were to do that at the beginning, I would probably write flowing, right? Because we have a lot of legato passages in those first three measures. Something of that nature. So that sort of gives us an idea, okay, rather than just playing mezzo forte, which is not really loud rather, and not really soft, we can play in a very flowing manner, which means we're probably going to play out a little bit more than you usually would, right? So when it comes to dynamic contrast, you want to really sort of think of these dynamics not only as loud and soft, but also as contrast in character. So perhaps in the beginning we have flowing, we have perhaps elegant would be another word maybe to describe the beginning. Again, we're at a rather slow tempo, quarter note 72 to 76, so we're not going very fast. We have adagio, monotropo marked at the beginning, which of course means slowly, but maybe not too slowly or too much slowly, right? So we want to, again, make sure that we're thinking of these dynamic contrasts as characters, which then fall into the pace of the piece, right? We do have several forte sections in this piece, so you want to make sure to play out through those sections. One of the most challenging is the section from the second half of measure 8 through the downbeat of 12, right? That's a forte section where we need to use a lot of air, push a lot of air through the instrument in order to negotiate the intervals, the intervallic leaps that we find in measure 10. And the same thing happens in measure 19. A lot of air, push the air through the instrument as you go up to the high E flat, right? If you use a weak airstream in these measures, 19 and measure 10, you will find that oftentimes the altissimo or upper notes, we call them altissimo notes, will not speak very well. So I like to think of forte and a strong airstream as kind of the airstream within forte rather being kind of a bridge through the intervals. In other words, you increase the air and you push through the intervals as you go up to the high E flat in measure 19, for instance, or as you go up to the high E natural in F in measure 10, right? So that's something to think about, right? So when we play forte, we want to use a very strong airstream and play out a lot so that these notes will speak, yeah? Good, and then we also have several sections where it's marked piano, which obviously means soft. Again, you can think about the character, perhaps dolce, which means sweetly, perhaps hidden or shy, you know, these types of terms to describe the way you play soft. And when you do that, you will play not only soft, but you will play with a little bit of character within the dynamics, which I think is not a bad idea, yeah? So overall, looking at dynamics, we're looking at them in terms of the character, and we're looking to try to produce as wide a range of the dynamics within what is written here, which is rather limited, but nonetheless, we want to sort of create as wide a dynamic range as we can, even though we may be in a slightly limited situation here, yeah? Good. And speaking of character, I think there are two main characters in this piece, at least for me, and this does not mean that I'm right. Certainly there might be more than two. But to my thinking, we have sort of this laid back and relaxed character that we hear throughout the beginning. And then when we get into measure 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, going then to 19, we get this character that's a little bit more animated and perhaps I would think of as a little bit more spirited, right? So that might be one way to think about the sort of the two characters that I hear in this piece. Of course, if you want to come up with more, that's wonderful. Yeah? Okay, good. So now let's talk a little bit about rhythm, right? So some of the rhythms in this piece are obvious, and some of them, I would say, are a little bit hidden, and you need to look very carefully at the music to notice them, right? So let's talk about these. The hidden rhythms, I find, are the ones that we see after dotted notes, right? So for instance, if we look at the end of measure 7, in the last beat of measure 7, we have a dotted 16th note followed by a 32nd note, right? And if we don't look carefully at the number of little lines on that last note of measure 7, we probably don't notice that this is a 32nd note, right? So yam ba ba instead of ya ba ba, right? So it's not a 16th note, that's a 32nd note, right? This happens again in another place. I just need to find really quickly here. It's measure 12, I believe. Let's see. No, measure 12, we have 16th notes, which is good. There's one other place here with the 32nd note. There it is. It's at the end of measure 16, right? So again, check out the end of measure 16. And the last beat of measure 16, we have a dotted 16th, again followed by what, to me, I would describe as a hidden 32nd note. In other words, you have to look really hard to notice that that's a 32nd note, right? And the judges, I'm sure, are going to be listening to this, so they're going to be listening to see whether you play a 16th note at the end of measure 16, or whether you play a 16th or 32nd note, and rather whether you play a 32nd note or 16th note at the end of measure 7. So be careful in those two places. Those are a little bit tricky, yeah? Other places to look for rhythms that might catch you off guard. If you look at measure 6, you will notice that the last note of measure 6 is an 8th note, right? So be careful not to play that as a 16th. The tendency is going to want you to play ya ba 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 instead of ya ba 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 bum ba, yeah? So be careful of the 8th note there at the end of measure 6. And this happens at also various places in the piece where you have an 8th note pickup rather than a 16th note pickup. Your tendency is probably going to want to be to do a 16th note, so just be careful of that, yeah? Good, let's see. As usual in these little etudes for the Allstate here in Virginia, there's always an ambiguous marking of some sort in the music, and this sort of ambiguous marking in this piece falls at the end of measure 11. We have an 8th note there under a poco rallentando that has both a dot and a dash over it. This seems to be contrary because obviously the dash, as we talked about before, means slightly longer and the dot means shorter. So here we have two contrasting articulations over the note. For me, when I see a marking like that, I tend to think of it as pick one of the other, right? So you will notice on the recording that I made here, on my playthrough of it, I played the 8th note at the end of measure 11 short. I thought it gave the piece a little bit more character that way. However, you could play it long. I think in these cases where we see these strange, contrary markings, dot and the dash at the same time, it's kind of the idea of you choose the one that you would like to do, and either one I think will work just fine for you, yeah? Good, let's see. So another area to look out for in terms of rhythm is the next to the last measure, right? Make sure that the G's are tied and we have a rhythm of bum ba, yeah? I think the tendency probably will be for you all to move to the 8th note too soon at the end of the next to last measure there, so be careful about that, yeah? And of course it's all under a little bit of a ritardando. I did a little bit more on my playthrough there. You don't have to do what I did, perhaps I did too much, who knows? But it does say poco ritardando, which means obviously a little bit of ritardando there at the end, yeah? Good. All right, so those are some little rhythm areas where you want to watch out for. Everything else is pretty straightforward. One other thing I'll point out is be careful at the end of measure 8, be careful at the end of measure 9, that you play again a 16th note at the end of those measures rather than a 32nd note. You've just played 32nd notes, so your tendency is going to want to play ba-da-da, ba-ba, instead of ba-ba, ba-ba. So be careful at the end of measure 8, be careful at the end of measure 9. Make sure those are 16th notes and not 32nd notes that you play there, okay? All right, good. I think in terms of rhythms, that's pretty much the spots that I would watch out for the most. They're a little bit tricky. Let's talk a little bit very briefly here about the differences in notations that indicate for us to slow down, right? We have two indications in this piece. We have a poco rallentando and we have a poco ritardando. And we also have a molto ritardando, right? Molto means a lot, so that means to slow down a lot, as in measure 14. At the end of measure 11, we have a poco rallentando, which also means to slow down. And we also have at the end of the piece a poco ritardando, which is a little ritardando, which we have there, which means to slow down a little bit at the end. Now, what's the difference between a rallentando and a ritardando? Generally, really the only difference is that oftentimes when we see a rallentando in music, it's accompanied by a diminuendo. And sure enough, if we take a look at measure 11, where we find the poco rallentando, there is indeed a diminuendo written there, right? So that's something to just know. Oftentimes when you see rallentando, you're going to have a diminuendo as a part of that measure. And sure enough, measure 11 in this piece, that's what we have, yeah? Okay, good. So now let's talk a little bit about some fingering combinations in this piece. Most of these etudes tend to have sections where you need to go back and forth between the left hand C and the right hand E flat, or perhaps a left hand D flat or C sharp and a right hand D sharp or E flat. And this piece is no different. We have places in this piece where we need to do that. The first place we can look at is in measure 4. There in the end of beat 1, in measure 4, you're going to play the E flat in the right hand, and then you're going to play the following C at the beginning of beat 2 in the left hand, right? Now, if you happen to have the auxiliary key over here as a part of your clarinet, you don't need to do that, but I suspect the majority of you don't have the auxiliary key. I don't have the auxiliary key, so you're going to need to use right hand E flat to left hand C there in measure 4, right? The next place, which is a little trickier, is if we go to measure 7, we find a section where, actually no, that's not measure 7. I wrote measure 7 here, but that is incorrect. It is not, oh, it is measure 7. I am right. See, I tricked myself. Okay, so in measure 7, if we look at the second part of beat 2, going into beat 3 of measure 7, we find what I would call an LR-LR combination, which means we need to move from the left to the right, to the left to the right. And in this case, in measure 7, halfway through, we end beat 2 on the left hand C, we move to the right hand E flat, then we move back to the left hand D flat or C sharp, and then we move to the right hand C, right? So be careful. You might need to rewind that part that I just said to go over that measure 7. That's a little bit tricky. In measure 16, I believe, on the third beat, yes, the third beat of measure 16, we have an RLR combination. In other words, right, left, right. And this appears on the third beat of measure 16. We start in the right hand in the E flat, we go to the left hand of the D flat, and then we go back to the right hand C before we go to the F, right, in beat 3 of measure 16. So be careful there as well, yeah? Those are the only 4 sections, I believe, although there's actually one more, sorry, in measure 19. Measure 19 is a little bit tricky, actually, and I actually cheated in the performance, and I'll explain what I mean by that. In measure 19, we have on the beat 1, we have E flat, right hand going to the left hand C, but the problem is we also then have to go to an A flat on beat 2 of measure 19, and that's tricky. That's tricky because it's really hard to get off this left hand C and go to the A flat, right? So I will say that I cheated in measure 1 there, measure 19. I actually did what we should not do, which is to slide from the E flat to the C at the end of beat 1 in measure 19, which then gets me to the A flat okay. Generally 9 times out of 10, 99.9% of the time, we're not going to do that. But I do think at this first beat of measure 19, you can get away with, if you do it smoothly, you can get away with sliding the E flat over to the C and then going up to the A flat like this. You should find that to be a little bit easier than doing right hand E flat, left hand C, and then trying to get off the left hand C to get up here to the A flat. That's tricky. So we actually do find there in measure 19, beat 1, a place where you actually can, and I'm going to say it, go ahead and slide between the E flat and C, okay? I did. So you can too. All right, another place to look at fingerings perhaps is measure 6. And when we look at measure 6, or rather the end of measure 6, the last 8th note, we have a G flat, which you can either play the traditional fingering here, or you can play F with the bottom 2 side keys, right? Which is what we call side G flat or side F sharp. Why would I want to use that fingering in that measure? Well, because when we get to the first measure of measure 7, first beat of measure 7 rather, we have another F, we have an F natural, and then we have another G flat, right? So for me, rather than switching back and forth here between the G flat and the F, I would rather do this. So I play the side G flat, go to F, and then I go back to the side again, and then I go to the A. And that avoids me having to do this, right? So the fingering again is F, bottom 2 side keys. That gives you a G flat or F sharp. And then you do not, and then you go back and forth to F rather this way, and you do not need to do this, okay? So that hopefully will help you there. If you don't know this fingering, this is a really good fingering for F sharp or G flat, okay? Good. All right, so I think that covers all of the categories I want to talk about this time. I will make one more suggestion in the last measure, or rather the next to last measure. One thing you want to do on that very last C, you know, the piece kind of ends and begins the same. We start with a tenuto marking on a quarter note, and we end this piece with a tenuto marking over a quarter note, right? At the beginning, obviously, we keep going, but at the end, we don't keep going. So my suggestion is on that last C is to hold it a little bit longer and then do what we call taper the note off, right? Just a diminuendo like this. The sound disappears. Try not to do what I would call guillotining the note. In other words, don't play da, da, and cut off that last C. Da, da, and just let it disappear, right? And that will bring your performance to a really beautiful ending, which again will help you in the minds of the adjudicators and help you to do a great job. All right, so these are my suggestions on the piece for this year. I hope they were helpful to you. If you have any questions about the piece, you can email me, gzoeter@su.edu, and I'm happy to answer any other questions that might come up. I'm sure I probably didn't cover everything here, but hopefully the talk that we've had here has been helpful for you. And I wish you all the best and good luck on your audition, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.